Senator Murray Sinclair was the guest speaker at the Bora Laskin Faculty of Law at Lakehead University, and here is the complete text of his talk at the faculty. This is James with Net News Ledger from Thunder Bay, Ontario.
Bonjour, les candidates, les énergiques et les efficaces. Que go do them. I'm always a little leery of introductions because my resume runs to about 38 pages now with all of the various events that I've been involved in and presented to, and papers I've written and awards I've received and things such as that. So I'm never quite sure when somebody asks for a copy of my CV what they're going to pick from it and put out there. And also because I'm never quite sure how they're going to use that information. I was being introduced at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law, and they asked a young Indigenous law student to do the introduction, and she was obviously quite nervous, you could tell from when she went up there. And she said, I have, at that time, Justice Sinclair, I have Justice Sinclair's resume, and it's very long. And I can't read it all to you because we don't have enough time, but I read it, and I want you to know that he's a well-rounded man. So succinctness is good. Accuracy, well, that's good too. When I was at an event in Saskatoon with the survivors, we had a room full of people. With most of the events that the TRC put on, we would be inundated at the last minute with people who attended that we didn't expect. We had scheduled a room that held about 2,500 people. We had about 5,000 people who showed up at this event. And of course, when survivors get together, I don't know if any of you have ever been involved in a survivor gathering, but they reminisce, they visit, they talk to each other about their family, their friends, and their teachers, and all of the things that you would expect to see from students and friends who haven't seen each other for a long time. And so we were scheduled to start at 8:30 in the morning. By 9:15, they still hadn't settled down. And the survivor who was chairing the event was trying to get them all to quiet down, and he would say, please, please, everybody sit down, we're going to start soon. And they wouldn't. They kept visiting and moving around and wouldn't sit and kept talking, and there he was having trouble being heard above the noise. And finally, he introduced me in 7 words, shortest introduction I've ever had. He said, shut up, sit down, here he is. So that works too. So I want to begin by acknowledging the invitation that I've received to deliver this lecture this evening and to talk particularly to the students, because this is about addressing the law students, about the difference between right and law, or knowing right and law, and talking about my experience in particular of coming to an understanding about that. And I'm going to talk to you, as you can see, without a note. And you're probably thinking, my God, he's never going to shut up because he doesn't have a limit on the number of words he's going to read to us. But I'll try not to do that. But more importantly, I want to talk to you about some things that I feel very strongly about, and combine all of the experiences that I've had, both as a student, a lawyer, a judge in the provincial court, a judge in the superior court, doing the inquiries that I've done, because I've done 3 of them, and working with survivors. And now, I'm a senator. Those of you who followed the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission may recall that on the final day of the final event of the TRC, when we delivered the final report to the public, we had a room full of, there must have been 3,000 or 4,000 people in the room. Plus, we webcast all of our events. That was our secret, because we knew that survivors couldn't travel, but we had arranged to webcast everything into the communities so that people could gather in community halls and watch all of the events over the internet. Most of the northern communities and some of the southern communities had internet access, so they could watch the events, and we webcast from beginning to end the entire event, and people appreciated that because we would tell them ahead of time who was going to speak and who was on the list of presenters, and the communities we were at, the schools we were going to be talking about, and they found it very helpful. And so we were webcasting that event, and it went on, as did most of our events, for 4 days. And then at the end of it, we delivered the report. When the report was being delivered, I said a number of things. But one of the things I said was, "This is my last public activity." And I didn't intend to lie to anybody. I really did intend to step back from public. And I said, here's why. I'm going to withdraw from public life. I had actually had a conversation with Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who had made the same announcement at around the same time. He did it for health reasons, but I wasn't so concerned about my health as I was concerned about my family. And I talked about that. My family had endured my being away for most of my career, from the time I was a lawyer, while I was a judge, and in the Senate, well, I wasn't in the Senate then, but in the work of the TRC, the work that I got involved in always took me away. And I tried to take my family members with me when I could, but it wasn't always feasible. And for long periods of time, I would be gone, particularly as a judge. I'd go on circuit in the north. I loved doing circuit work, so I kept a dedicated circuit, traveled through northern communities. During the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry, we traveled throughout North America. We visited all of the communities in Manitoba, plus we went to Oklahoma to see the tribal courts there, Navajo Nation tribal court, and visited with tribal court chairs, tribal court judges from all across the United States, and wrote a report about Aboriginal people in the justice system in 1991, which led to a significant number of changes. But all of that, again, took time away from family. And I remembered the time when I was a young lawyer, I got called to an auntie meeting. Now, I was raised by my grandmother, because my mother died when I was a year old. And my father, who couldn't cope with having to deal with little children because he was a veteran of the war and badly injured and was not able to deal with all of the stresses in his life, he took us, there were 4 of us, he took us to my grandparents and asked them to take care of us. My grandmother was 63, my grandfather was 69 at the time, far too old to qualify as foster family in the child welfare system today, but at that time there were no systems in place that kind of oversaw that in the same way that we see them today. So my father pretty much abandoned us to my grandparents. They took care of us. They took us in. But my grandmother, she was a determined and organized woman. She had been in a residential school, and she had some experiences there working with the nuns, but she was also, I think, part military sergeant. All of her boys, all of my uncles ended up in the military during the Second World War. And she was quite proud of that. She insisted that they had to make a contribution. So that was how they did it. And so when we went to live there, she assigned each one of us, me, my 2 brothers, and my sister, she assigned each one of us to one of the aunties. So there were 8 aunties in our family, all still living at home. And so I was assigned to my Auntie Josephine. My Auntie Josephine was a teacher, and she was a determined teacher. She practiced teaching on me. When I was 12 years old, she bought me the Book of Knowledge, which is a complete set of encyclopedias. Any of you remember this book? Those of you over 60 might remember it. The Book of Knowledge was sort of like the first book of encyclopedias that came out in Canada. When I was 12 years old, she bought me a complete set of the Book of Knowledge, and she said, "You have 1 year to read every book." Wow. And I did. I loved it. I loved reading. I loved learning things. I loved what the books taught me. And she was a teacher, plus, of course, I had my grandmother supervising all of this, but my aunt, Josephine, saw to it that I answered questions from the book that she had for me, and so I learned. And I finished reading that, plus the annual books that came out for years after that. She was not just my mentor, but she was really my mother growing up. And my sister had one of the aunts as her mentor, as her mother, and my brothers, each of my brothers was assigned to another aunt. And they were responsible for raising us, responsible for getting us dressed, for feeding us, for making sure that we got to school on time, for making sure that we were involved in activities, for transporting us. And when they moved away, got married and moved away, we moved with them. So I moved with my Auntie Josephine. And that's where I lived for most of my teenage years. And when it came to decision-making in the family, it was always on a collective basis. My grandmother would call all of the women together, never the men, all of the women together, and they would make decisions about us. So when I wanted to go to university, all of the aunties got together and talked about it. And they decided that I could go to university. And so none of the others wanted to go, so there wasn't a discussion, but I was sent. And so I was given direction on how to go to university. But after I graduated from law school, my grandmother had passed away by then, I was called to an auntie meeting. All 8 aunties called me and said, "We want to meet with you." And they used to have these auntie meetings whenever we did something bad, so I thought I must have done something bad, but I didn't know what it was. So I went to the auntie meeting, and I had to bring the food. I had to feed them. I went to the auntie meeting, and the aunties were all sitting there around the dining room table of one of my auntie's places, and they said, the oldest auntie, my Auntie Bertha, said, "Okay, my boy, sit down." So I did. I was just thankful they weren't going to spank me. But I was about 24 years old then, 25. And they said, so I said, "What's going on?" And they said, "Well, we have something we need to tell you." And I said, "Okay, what is it?" And they said, "You're traveling too much without your wife." And I said, "Oh, what does that mean?" She said, "When you travel, you shouldn't leave your wife behind all the time. You should take her with you. It's not good for your family to do that." So I said, "Well, she has a career, she has a job, she's an educator, she can't just leave when I have to go up north and visit communities and go visit clients." And they said, "When she can travel with you, you take her with you. And if she can't travel with you, then you take something with you that belongs to her, something that she's made for you. And you ask her to give you something to take, so that you always have something that'll remind you of her. Because," and then my Aunt Rose piped in, "because there are women out there waiting for guys like you." My Auntie Rose was the direct one, as you could tell. And I said, "Well, I have the wedding ring, I wear it all the time." And she said, "Oh, that means nothing." I said, "You always wear something that'll help you, it'll guard you, it'll protect you." And so that's what I do. when I travel, I have something that my wife has made for me, and I carry, and I tell her, I'm taking this. And so today I'm taking this, because she made this for me. But whenever I travel, I do that, because it's important. But for many years, I had to travel without her and only take these things along. And so at the end of the TRC, on the very last day, I said, I'm now stepping back from public life in order to spend more time with my wife. It's important. It's important to her. It's important to our children. It's also important to our grandchildren, because we had 4 at that time. And I said, so this work is now for others to do. And you may remember I said that we have described for you a mountain, and we have shown you the way to the top. And now we call upon you to do the climbing, because this is a challenge for all Canadians. It should be left to those who wrote this report to make sure this report is done. It's for others as well. And so I said, now I'm stepping back, and I'm going to go about re-establishing good relationships with my wife, my family. And so that's what I did. I retired from the court. I handed in my retirement papers on January the 31st. And then on February the 8th, Trudeau called. And I said, Prime Minister, actually I called him nephew, because his mother's a Sinclair. And at the national event, I said to him, your mother was a Sinclair, that means you're my nephew. And he said, yes, uncle. So I said, nephew, I said, you can't ask this of me. Because I already told my family, I've committed to my family that I would stay home, I would travel less, I would be with them more. And he said, I understand that, why don't you let me know what your decision is then? So I said, well, I have to talk to them. So I did. So we had a family gathering, and to my surprise, they were all very supportive of my taking a position in the Senate. Well, first of all, I said to Prime Minister Trudeau, I said, okay, let's get this straight. I said, I've been a judge now for almost 30 years. Being a judge in Canada is one of the most respected positions in the whole country. In the whole country, it is the one position that everybody has great respect for, even though they may not agree with what judges do sometimes, but they all respect judges. If they have a problem, they want to go to court because they want to get judges to straighten it out. So judges have a position of respect in society. Plus, I've just written the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was a life-changing experience, not only for those who were involved, but for this country. I'm riding a really big wave, a really high wave here. And you want me to go to the Senate? And he said, yes, because there are things there that I'd like you to do. And so I said, well, I have to talk to my family, and they were surprisingly quite supportive of that. They said, they all had good reasons. My 4 daughters, my son, all had good, sound, rational reasons why I should do it, and that they were willing to step up and to help out whenever necessary. And I said, well, that's all well and good, but there's only one voice that really counts here. So I turned to Catherine Nimkikoi. I said, so what do you think? And she said, well, you've been retired for 8 days now. You've organized the cupboards twice, and I can't find a damn thing. So I was going to ask you to get out of the house and do something useful. And so this was her idea of my getting out of the house and doing something useful. But I have to say that the transition from moving from the court into the Senate was a tricky transition, because it's moving from a position where I literally have the last word and everybody has to do what I tell them. Of course, except for Nimkikoi. She didn't have to do anything I told her. She's Catherine is, some of you may know, Catherine's of the Bear Clan. I'm Fish Clan. That sort of describes our relationship. She says that fish only exist to feed the bear, okay? So I'll tell you another little story before I get into the... One day, after we had been married a long time, we were walking down the street together, and this guy, Anishinaabe guy, is walking the other way, and they're kind of looking at each other, and finally she said a name, and he said, "Yeah, is that you, Catherine?" And he said, "Yeah." They started chatting and talking, and they were just talking away like old friends, which they were, obviously. And I was standing there, totally ignored. Totally ignored. They talked for about 10 minutes. Not once did they acknowledge me. She didn't even introduce me to this guy. And so they said their goodbyes. I found out from listening that he was a teacher up north and that he'd been teaching. He had a family, 8 kids. He had almost 30 grandchildren, he was telling her. And that things have been hard for a while, but now things were looking up. So then they finished talking, said their goodbyes, and off she and I went down the street. And half a block later I said, "Well, that was interesting." And she said, "What do you mean?" And she said, and I said, "Well, I was there the whole time, and you never even introduced me to this guy. What is he, like an old boyfriend?" She said, "Oh, he's nobody." I said, "Come on now, he's an old boyfriend, right? Come on, he's an old boyfriend, admit it." And she said, yeah. He and I dated in university." I said, "Well, aren't you lucky then?" And she said, "What?" I said, "Well, look at this, you're married to me, Judge of the Court of Queen's Bench, head of the TRC, head of the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry. I have a good reputation. People talk to me. People talk about me." And she looked at me and she said, "Hell, if I'd married him, he'd have been the head of the TRC." So it's important to know your place. You can stand up for yourself, but it's important to know your place and to understand how these things are. So when my aunties called me into that meeting, it was because of that. I've been raised by strong women. I've been guided by them throughout my life. Not only do I have the benefit of strong women of my generation and older who have been prepared to step up and take care of me, but I have my granddaughter, Sarah. I want to see a picture of Sarah. You pick one up? This is Sarah when she's 5 years old. She's at the ribbon cutting ceremony for the TRC back in 2009. She's 5 years old in that picture, and the reason that I like to show that picture to people is because that's how old the children were when they were taken away and placed in residential schools. You probably have cell phones on you that have photos, and you probably have a photo of your favorite daughter when she was little, or your favorite grandchild, or your favorite niece, your favorite nephew, your favorite little kid. That's mine. And so she's also my boss. She's a bossy little girl because she's learned from her cookum, from her grandmother. My wife has taught her when Musham's doing something and I'm not there, that she has license to correct me. One day I was leaving the house and I was going to go to a meeting, and so I put on my coat and put on my jacket, and I put on my favorite baseball cap, the Boston Red Sox baseball cap, and off I was about to go, and she said, "Musham, stop." I said, "What?" "You cannot leave this house wearing that hat." I said, "Sure I can. I won't take it into the meeting, I just want to drive with it on." And she said, "Kokum," grandmother, she said, "Kokum, come here." And then she stood there, put her hands on her hips, and Catherine came running out saying, What, something happened, what? And she said, "Kokum, look at this." Pointing to me. That's the next generation of the bossy women of my life. When I was appointed to the Senate, Sarah was a little older, and she asked me to come to her classroom to talk about the transition from being a judge to being a senator. So I said, sure, I was glad to do it. And so I went to her class. She was introducing me, and she introduced me to her class, and she talked about my work as a judge, the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry. She did all her research. And she just talked about the TRC because she had been to all of the national events. And this was, by this time now, she's 12 years old. And she talked about all of the national events and the work of the TRC. And she said, at the end of it all, she said, and now my mushroom is a senator. And then she looked at me and sat down. And at that point, a little boy put up his hand, and Sarah looked at him and stood up and said, yes. And he said to her, what does a senator do? And she looked at me, and I could tell that she did not know. She never asked me that question. She did not know. But she is her grandmother's grandchild. So she turned to that little boy, and she put her hands on her hips, and she stared at him for a good 2 seconds and said, he sanitizes. And then she stared at him for another 5 seconds, daring him to ask another stupid question. And he didn't dare. So she knows how to control the situation. And one day I was having a conversation with her, and I said, I just want you to know, my girl, I'm really proud of you. I'm proud of what you're doing. I'm proud of how you're behaving. I'm proud of how you're growing up. And I really look forward to the day that I'm going to be able to see you become that wonderful woman that I know you're going to grow up to be. And she said, just wait. And then she went into the back room, and she came out, pick two, and she was dressed like that. And she said, this is just so you don't overload me with your expectations. She said, I'm still my own person. And she is. But the reason I wanted you to see her, and I wanted you to get to know her and the family a little bit, is because they have always been in the forefront of my mind in the work that I do. I do not do a thing without thinking about them. I do not try to figure things out without figuring out how it's going to impact them. I wrote the report of the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission with them in mind, because I want them to have a good future. I want them to be living in a better place. I want them to be able to walk down the street and not be afraid, not be scared that they're going to be apprehended and kidnapped, placed in a car and never be seen again. I want them to live a life that will be healthy, that will be capable of meeting their expectations, and that will be ready for them, because they, every single one of them, are coming with guns blazing, ready to fix things. But not all of them are. Our young people are having a hard time today. And our young people are having a hard time because of this history that we now know about. The history of residential schools is part of that history. But people have always asked me, how many people actually went to residential schools? They say 150,000, but that's not the entire population of Indigenous people. And I say it's true. Jim Miller, a good friend who's a history prof at the University of Saskatchewan, estimates that between 30 and 35% of Indigenous children, First Nations children, went to residential schools. And that means 65, 70% of the Indigenous population didn't go to a residential school. And yet, why do we see such widespread dysfunction, such widespread difficulties, such widespread poverty, such widespread unemployment, such widespread incarceration rates, such widespread child apprehension rates, and dropout rates from our schools, and health problems, and substandard housing, and all of those things? Why are they so widespread if residential schools were only in contact with such a small part of the entire population? Well, first of all, you have to think about the number of people that those 30 to 35% influenced in the course of their lives. They not only influenced the people within their families, of course, when they came out of the schools, but they also influenced all of the people around them. So their behavior influenced their communities. But on top of that, if you didn't go to a residential school, you went to a day school on the reserve, or you went to a public school. I went to a public school. I went to public schools in Selkirk, Manitoba, where I grew up for all of my life. And I was taught in those schools the same thing that the children in residential schools were taught. Maybe not as directly, maybe not as forcefully, maybe not with the same level of physical and harsh discipline, maybe not involving the withholding of food, maybe not involving the sexual abuse that went on at nighttime. But I still went to a school that taught me that the beginning of the history of this place began in 1491, 1492, when Jacques Cartier and all of those other European explorers came here. And they called this the New World. They didn't talk about this as the Old World. They didn't talk about the world before they came here. They never taught us that. Never taught us about the history of our people. Never taught us about the way that we saw things and believed things, and did things. Never taught us that we had been here for 15,000 years. That's what the anthropologists are prepared to admit, but we know that probably that number is much higher. Some estimates say Indigenous people have been here for at least 100,000 years. And that's probably true. But even accepting the 15,000 years, people were living in these parts of the world in organized societies for the bulk of that period of time. Organized societies. And what does that mean? You cannot have an organized society unless you've got a form of leadership, a structure to the community, a way of organizing yourselves so that you can resist those who might attack you, so that you can formulate responsibilities within the community. Who's going to take care of the children while the men are off hunting? Who's going to take care of the elders when they become too old to fend for themselves? What are the rules around that? What are the rules around where we pitch our tents and put up our communities? What are the rules around when the hunt starts and when it doesn't start? We need rules. So every society has rules. Every society has rules that govern things like who can you marry? When can you get married? What are the rules behind being married? And there are rules around that. Some very, very finite rules. In our tribe, Anishinaabe, Ojibwe people, you're not allowed to marry within your clan. So my children cannot marry somebody of a fish clan. It is forbidden. And that's because it's a taboo. It's a taboo to commit incest, to have relations with a relative. And so you cannot marry a relative. You have to marry outside of the kinship group, outside of your clan. So I married a bear. That was my mistake. She's the one who trapped me. That's the way I say it. It's a picture of a bear in a waterfall. If you say it, the fish is jumping up the waterfall and being grabbed by a bear in the mouth. That's us. But you can marry outside of your clan, but you cannot marry within your clan. It's a very strong rule. And there are very strong rules about who has a say about the raising of children. In our community, it's the women. When the child is young, is small, boys and girls, from the time that they're born until they reach a certain age, they are all subject to the direction, to the control, to the education of the women. All of the aunties, the mothers, the grandmothers, the older sisters, they all have a role to play with regard to the education of those little children, including the little boys. I remember when I was a little guy, and I remember to this day that my grandmother always had tasks for us that involved doing kitchen work, doing housework. One day she said to us that she didn't like when people buttered their toast and left crumbs on the butter. So me and my little brother, a year younger than me, our responsibility was to scrape the butter, to get those crumbs off the butter. And then we put that butter that had the crumbs into a separate dish, and we gave that to our grandfather. Because he didn't care. He'd eat them. And nobody else was wanting to. But as little boys, my grandmother and my aunties saw to it that every day we did that. But unfortunately, for me and my brother, we figured out really early that our dog, Chum, would lick that butter clean if we held the dish low enough. He would lick all of those crumbs off. And when we handed the butter dish back, it was perfectly clean. It looked just right. And we did that until we got caught. And then we got disciplined. And then we understood what it meant. But we had rules. We had rules in our family. The rules were very strictly enforced. We weren't allowed, for example, to throw our hair away. My grandfather cut our hair every month. Cut it like we were in the military. Cut our hair. And my grandmother swept it up, put it in a bag, and she burnt it in a fire. Now this was even though she had spent all of her life in a residential school and was a firm Catholic. She followed the Catholic teachings closely. And she was determined that we would all grow up to become Catholics. But she followed those old traditional ways because she knew that there was something to them. And she burnt that hair. And we still do that in our family because the teaching is that within each strand of hair, part of your spirit resides, and that spirit must be allowed to return back to the Creator. And the way to do that is to put it in the fire and let it return that way, in a natural way. So you don't throw it away and dismiss it. It's part of who we are. We had rules, and those rules were laws. Those were our laws. We had laws about everything. When we were doing the work of the TRC, one of the best sources of information that we found were actually the Jesuit relations. Those of you who are students here might know that when the Jesuits went out and did missionary work among the indigenous people of North America, they had to keep journals of everything. And in keeping those journals, they wrote everything they saw, and they gave their impression of everything they saw. And their impression were that these were people who had some very strict laws, some very strict rules, and they had to be respected. And they had to be careful about not disrespecting them, not doing something that was contrary to those laws, because they would be kicked out. They could be punished as well if they disobeyed a local law. Most people are not aware that when the European colonizers, settlers first arrived here, Jacques Cartier, when he settled, they talk about him planting a cross and claiming the land for New France, but they don't mention the fact that before he planted that cross, he participated in a ceremony with indigenous leaders in which he smoked the pipe. And that ceremony was actually a ceremony of welcome, a ceremony that he had to do in order to be allowed to put that cross up. They didn't know what the cross was all about, but they had to participate in that ceremony. And that was part of the law. The law, when you're coming into somebody's territory, is you have to acknowledge that welcoming event. Even today, when you go into somebody's territory, you have to ask for permission. I have friends. One of the elders of the TRC was from the West Coast, and he was known as the chief of the beach. That's how they translated his title. And his responsibility was, when newcomers came to the territory, they had to approach the beach and he had to stand there. And he had to challenge them in a loud voice to introduce themselves before they were allowed to land. And they had to speak from their canoes before they were allowed to land, to introduce themselves and to say who they were and why they were there. And then, once he was satisfied that they were coming in peace, that they could be welcomed, then he would give them permission to land. And that's true. I participated in a ceremony one time with traditional Ojibwe people in Michigan and the Six Nations people in that area who wanted to have a meeting. The Six Nations people came down the road, they sang a song and stopped 4 times. And each of the times that they stopped, the traditional people from the Ojibwe side sang a song back to them. And so that's how they came together. And each of the songs was, we come in friendship, we welcome you in friendship. We come in friendship, we welcome you in friendship. And so, what all of that means is that we need to know that we were just as valid. We had a way of doing things. We have a responsibility as a society. Every society has a responsibility when raising our children to help them answer 4 questions. And that first question is the most important question because it's the one you think of when you're little. The first question you ask is, where did I come from, Mommy? Where did I come from? How did I get in your tummy? Where did I come from? But that question is not just about, how did I get in your tummy? That question is, where do we come from? What is our creation story? How did we come to be on this earth, and in particular in this part of the earth? And that question is an important question. That's all about the history of the people. Canada is very specific about teaching that information to the children in public schools. But it's their story. It's their information. It's their creation story. It's not ours. Our creation story is different. And our creation story is true. But the story of the Europeans that they tell about how they were created and where they came from, that's true too. And our elders say all creation stories are true. And we have to respect that. We have to understand that. It's all part of that question. Where do I come from? And it gives you a sense of why we are here, what we're doing in this part of the territory, and how we came to be here. Where do I come from? And where do we come from? Gives you a sense of belonging to a people. And following on that question is also the next question, which is, where am I going? And that isn't just like, what am I going to eat for supper? Or what am I going to do tomorrow? That question is also, what am I going to do when I grow up? What am I going to be when I grow up? What can I be when I grow up? What are my responsibilities? What are we going to be like as a society when I'm an adult? What is our leadership? What is our government, our governance going to look like? And what will be my role in it? And also, that question is, what happens to me when I die? That's an important part of that question. That question is about faith as well, as is the question about creation. How were we created? It's also, where am I going after I die? What happens to me? That's part of that story. And the third question that everybody needs to know the answer to is, why am I here? What's my purpose in life? Why am I here? Why are we here? Why am I here? Helps me answer that question of why we are here, but why am I here? And in my community, that comes from knowing your spirit name. My spirit name is Mzinigijik. Mzinigijik. That literally means pictures in the sky. And it's the story about a young man, who goes out when his people are struggling, are in strife or in difficulty. He goes out each day to talk to the Creator, to ask the Creator to guide him so that he can help his people figure things out. Mzinigijik. And he has shown the pictures in the sky tell him what to tell the people. There's a long story about that name. And it's told to me every time that I see the elders who were there when I was named. They talk about my name. I found my name in the Jesuit Relations, incidentally, in the 1640s. The Jesuits wrote about this man. His name was Mzinigijik. So I was really proud to hear that my name goes back at least that far, and that it was a name given to a prominent Indigenous man. But you know what they said about him? They said, you have to watch out for this Mzinigijik guy, because wherever we go and tell the people about Christianity, about Jesus, he comes behind us and he tells them not to believe us. He's not somebody that's working for us, he's working against us. So Mzinigijik was a terrorist, somebody who opposed what was going on in his own way. He was reinforcing for the people that they have just as valid a way of doing things, and they don't need these others coming here and trying to take that away from them. And in a way, that's what I do too. Mzinigijik, the one who speaks of pictures in the sky. That's what my name is. And I use that information. I use what I learned to help people understand why things are the way they are. And all of that goes to help us answer the fourth question, which is probably the most important question. And that is, who am I? Who am I? And that question of who am I is a very important question, because it's also about who are we? Who are we as Anishinaabe people? And who are we to be different from others? What makes us different? All of that is part of it. Understanding that is part of it. And when you grow up and you are raised in an environment in which you are not told the answers to that question, you are born without direction. You do not have a compass. You do not have a sense of where you come from. You do not have a sense of where you're going. You do not have a sense of why you are here. And you do not have a sense of who you are. And that leads us to what we see today all around us. I want to play a video for you so that you can see what I mean. I talk to thousands of young people every year I speak at high school graduations, I speak to classes, I speak to law school students, I speak to Indigenous students who come to the Senate, I speak to students over the internet, webcasts that I conduct. And the reason I do that is because I want them to understand that what they see going on around them is not their fault. I want them to know that what they see going around them with their families and in their communities, among their leadership, what they hear from people in society who are not Indigenous, what they hear in the racist rants of others in society is not true. And what they see in their households, the dysfunction that they may be living in, or may have come out of, or may be trying to avoid, or may be part of. There's a reason for all of that. One of the things I also want them to know is that when they see some of this going on in the streets, my children ride the bus in Winnipeg when they were going to school. My granddaughter rides the bus when she goes to school. And she sees some of those Indigenous people who are living on the streets and having a hard time. And without knowing what she knows, she could come to believe that there's something wrong with us, that we are inherently weak, that we are inferior, just like they taught us in school, that there's something about us that's wrong, that we are the ones responsible for our own misfortune because we have not been able to do something that we should have done. But I want them to know that we were living not in a perfect society. That story of Mzinagijik who goes out to look for answers for his people is also a story about how his people were in strife, his people were facing difficulty. But it is a story about how we solved our own problems, and we used our own ways of doing things to solve our own problems. And we could do it again if we learn about those techniques. But I want them to know this, that from the time of Confederation, the Government of Canada deliberately set out on a course to destroy us as a people. They deliberately set out on a course to take us away from our culture, to take us away from our communities, to take us away from our families, and place us in institutions, and to place us with people who knew nothing about us, and who were charged with indoctrinating us into a different way of being. And I want them to know that the parents of those children who were taken away and placed in those schools, when they heard what was being done to their children, they tried to do something about it. They tried to go and take their children out of those schools. They tried to stop sending their children to those schools. But the government passed a law that said, if you do not send your children to these schools, then you will go to jail. And we have documented in the work of the TRC the numbers of times that parents were arrested and incarcerated until they disclosed where their children were, so that they could be placed in those schools. And if the parents didn't like the fact that their children were being harshly disciplined in the schools, or they might have experienced sexual or physical abuse in the schools, the government created what they called the pass system. If you were an Indigenous person and you left your community, you would be arrested, unless you had a written pass from the Indian agent for a specific period of time with a specific destination, allowing you to leave the reserve. But you had to return, or they would arrest you. And if they arrested you, they held you until you promised to go back to your community. And if you wanted to protest, that's a favorite thing of ours today, right? Everybody protests. You know, let's block a railroad, let's block a road, Let's block a pipeline. Let's protest. March up and down in front of the courthouse. March up and down in front of the legislative building. March up and down in front of a school. Let's protest. So in 1888, they passed a law called the Indian Conspiracy Law, which said that it was illegal for Indigenous people to gather together for the purpose of protesting or discussing a protest against the government of Canada. That became known as the Indian Conspiracy Law. And in order to undermine Indigenous leadership and do away with the role of elders and the role of traditional leaders, in 1891 they passed what was called the Indian Advancement Act, that said traditional leaders could no longer hold office, that they had to give up their positions to elected leaders who were elected in accordance with the Indian Act. And only men could hold office. The role of women was totally undermined. And only men could have meetings. And they had to notify the Indian agent when they had a meeting, and the Indian agent chaired the meeting when they held them. And he kept all the documents. No documents were ever allowed to be kept by the Indigenous community. And if you couldn't protest, you couldn't keep your kids out of the school, if you wanted to go to court in order to stop this from happening and challenge that law, they passed a law in 1888 that said nobody could go to court. An Indian person or a non-Indian person could go to court to challenge any law made by the government of Canada concerning Indians unless they got permission from the Minister of Indian Affairs first. And nobody ever got permission. And so you couldn't keep your children out of the schools, you couldn't go and get them out of the schools, you couldn't protest at what was happening, you couldn't go to court to stop it from happening. And then on top of that, they passed what were called the Sundance and Potlatch laws, which were a whole host of laws outlawing Indian ceremonies generally. You couldn't go to a sweat lodge. You couldn't even dress up like an Indian if you were an Indian. If you were a white guy, you could dress up like an Indian, but Indigenous people were prevented legally from dressing up in their traditional Indian garb. There's a famous case from 1927 involving the chief of Sioux Valley Nation, who was invited by the mayor of Rivers, Manitoba, to ride his horse in full garb in the Canada Day celebration parade. And he was arrested by the Rivers police, by the police department of the very town that the mayor had invited him to, for dressing up like an Indian. And so all of those laws worked towards undermining Indigenous people. Couldn't leave your community, you couldn't celebrate with others, you couldn't participate in healing ceremonies. Your ability to do that became outlawed. And so not only were they damaging the children in the schools, but they were preventing them from being healed by their own elders when they came home. And if they only did that for 1 or 2 generations, they could probably have gotten over it. In the United States, boarding schools were only in place for about 50 years. Our boarding schools were in place for 130 years. 1996 is when they closed down the last boarding school in Canada. 7 generations of children went through the residential schools in this country. And on top of all of that, dozens of generations of Indigenous children continued to be educated in the public schools that Indigenous people were inferior, European people were superior, that Indigenous people did not have a history worth talking about, that they were savages, they were heathens, they were pagans, that they were bloodthirsty, that they didn't have anything that was worth talking about that existed prior to 1491, and that they were responsible for their own demise. And they were lucky that the Canadian government saved them from becoming extinct. That was the ultimate insult. that somehow the perpetrator became our savior. And even today, with the child welfare system pretending that it's saving Indigenous children by apprehending them and putting them into care, the perpetrators continue to follow the fallacy that they are saving us, when in reality, the only people who can save us is ourselves. And we have to do that. The answer is that we have to save ourselves from the rest of this society, and this society has to get out of the way. Thank you very much.